You so much, Caden and Danny. Back when I first started living on my own, I finished college and seminary. I'd already started pastoring, got my own house, and very quickly I discovered something important. Graduates, take note of this. They don't talk about this in school. Food does not appear. Were you aware of that? Food does not just magically appear. You either go to a restaurant and get it, or you go to the kitchen and prepare it. So becoming aware of this, certainly I would go to restaurants my fair share, but that gets very expensive very quickly. And I just decided, you know, what I need to be doing is cooking meals for myself. Now, in truth, I knew next to nothing about cooking, but they have these amazing, wonderful inventions. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're called cookbooks. And inside there's these magical things inside called recipes. Recipes are inside. And in the recipe, you are told not simply what the dish is, what its outcome is going to be, but the ingredients are listed in the right portions. There are directions that tell you what to do with these various ingredients, and if you follow those instructions, you'll wind up with something that you can actually eat. And so at this point, because I know how to, I could boil water, I could scramble an egg, that was about it. So I'm going to cookbooks for everything, and I'm spending a fair amount of time looking at cookbooks and looking at different recipes. And along the way, I discovered or saw this recipe for pecan logs. I like pecan logs. I don't eat them all the time, but anytime I'd ever had one before, it was always one that I'd bought somewhere. And I thought, well, I've never had a homemade pecan roll. That'd be something different to make. And the ingredients list was pretty simple. You had crushed pecans. Those were attached to the log with Kraft caramels that I believe were melted with evaporated milk. But then the log portion itself was made of just two ingredients, marshmallow cream and powdered sugar. So I go to the store and I bought these ingredients. And the truth is, it wasn't very cheap. Pecans aren't cheap, and the Kraft caramels weren't cheap. But anyway, I get all these ingredients, I get home, and I start. The first thing I do is to take all these pecan halves and I crush them into small pieces. So that's ready. Then I unwrap, and it took me forever to unwrap an entire bag of Kraft caramels. If you've ever had to do that for a recipe, if you see that, don't cook that. It's just a pain. Anyway, so I do that, and they're ready to be melted. The next thing that I need to do before I can do anything else is to make the logs themselves. And again, that's made out of marshmallow cream and powdered sugar. The recipe just says this: mix the marshmallow cream and the powdered sugar. What does mix mean? Well, clearly it means use the mixer. So I put this jar of marshmallow cream and this box of powdered sugar into the mixing bowl. I lower the beaters into it and I turn it on high. Now, what exactly is powdered sugar? Well, it's sugar, but it's powder. It's essentially dust. What happens if you put dust into a mixer and turn it on high? It goes everywhere. What happened to my powdered sugar? It goes everywhere. It looks like there's been a small explosion now in my kitchen. Everything is covered in this white, sweet powder. And I am furious. I really am, because I'm aggravated that I've spent money now on buying these pecans and I've spent all this time with these sticky Kraft caramels, unwrapping them. And it seems like all that's a bust. I've wasted money, I've wasted time, and all I've got now is a big mess to have to clean up. And I'm just furious just to get the stress out, to express my frustration. I stick my hand into the mixing bowl and I squeezed as tight as I could. All of a sudden it dawns on me that's stuck together. That's how you make these things. And all of a sudden it dawns on me, mixing these two ingredients doesn't mean to use a mixer. It means to just mix these things by hand. And so finally I was able to make them. They're available now at Stuckey's on your travels. But recipes I've discovered like that are frustrating, where they tell you to do things and just assume that you know how to actually do that the way they intend. That they tell you what to do, but they don't give you the instructions on actually how to do that. That's frustrating. That's frustrating when it comes to cooking. It's frustrating when it comes to school. You may have had a math teacher at some point in the past that says, for homework tonight, I want you to do these 20 problems, and they didn't really tell you how to do those problems. That's frustrating. It's frustrating at work when the boss assigns some type of a project and says, hey, I need you to do this and I need it done by this date, but they don't give you an instruction on exactly how to do it. That's frustrating when you have directives, tasks, or commands to follow, but don't have the instructions on how to actually do that. To think about that through the spiritual lens for a moment, you recognize that God in His Word has given to us an awful lot of directives, a lot of commands, a lot of things that He says, do this, don't do that. I want you to make sure that you do this. It would be the height of frustration if all God did was to say, do all of these things, but never give us the instructions on how to actually do it. The good news is, not only does God give us His expectations, He reveals to us how we can actually accomplish those expectations and accomplish the tasks that He assigns. Now, we have for a number of weeks now been working our way through 1 Peter in a series that I've called Beside. And we've been talking about the fact that as a follower of Christ, He has made a difference in our lives. He has made us different. And in a very real and significant way, though we are still among people, we're still in the world, there's very much a sense in which we're no longer part of that group. We're part of a different group. We're among them, but we're kind of beside, just not a part. And last week we looked at a passage where God, through Peter, gives to us a command that says very simply this: conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear. And we noted that this is a healthy type of fear, being aware of the fact that God's going to hold us to account, and so that's going to affect how we live. Conduct yourselves, though, throughout the time of your stay here in fear. That's the command. That's the directive. That's what He's expecting of us. So we're left with this question: how do we do it? How do we, once we hear the command, once we know what He wants us to do, how do we actually accomplish that? Thankfully, God, through Peter, gives us the answer to that. We see it in 1 Peter chapter 1. We're going to start today with verse 18. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting with verse 18. Got a Bible, hopefully you can follow along with me, where Peter says this: knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through Him believe in God, who raised Him from the dead and gave Him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Now, ultimately, our instructions on how to actually accomplish this we see in verses 18 and 19. And in just a couple of verses, not only has Peter given to us God's expectation, but he's given us the way that we can actually accomplish this. So the expectation, again, is this: conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear. How do you do that? First of all, know a couple of things. Here's the first one. Know that other paths are futile. Know that other paths are futile. Well, the fact that verse 18 in my Bible, and probably in yours, does not begin with a capital letter is indicative of the fact that this is very much tied to verse 17. So let's go back and get that. Peter says, and if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, here's the command: conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear. Now, we talked about a couple of things last week. First of all, and just for review's sake, when we hear the word fear, most of the time we think about that and view it entirely as a negative experience. I mean, that we're afraid of danger, we are afraid of threats, and all of those things we view negatively. And very much there is a negative fear that prompts these feelings of just weighty, palpable anxiety in the face of uncertainty. But that's not the only type of fear. There's a positive type of fear that prompts or generates cautiousness or respect. And last week I shared with you, for example, that I have a fear of electricity. That doesn't mean that I won't flip a light switch on, but it does mean if I go to replace that switch, I go to change an outlet, I'm going to go to the breaker and turn that breaker off. Why? Because I have a fear of electricity, and that leads me to deal with it cautiously and respectfully, with very much a sense of cautiousness and awe of it. It is that type of mentality that we are to have in terms of our living before God, because he says in verse 17 that God is going to hold us to account. He's going to judge each one's work. And we talked about the manner in which Peter describes that it's not a superficial judgment. It's not based on how things appear. It's not judging a book by its cover, but that God sees us heart, mind, and soul, everything to the core of our being. He doesn't merely see what we do and hear what we say. He knows what we're thinking. He knows about our attitudes, our motivations. He knows what it is that we are feeling. And as we stand before him, he's going to hold all of that to account. And because of that, Peter says, cautiously, with reverence before God, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here. Well, how do we do that? Well, verse 18 begins with this word, knowing. And what he's getting ready to say is this. If you will know just a couple of things, get these thoughts in the forefront of your mind, then you can do what he has said in verse 17. And so first of all, he says, know that you were not redeemed. Now, when Peter is talking about us being redeemed or redemption, he's talking about the process by which you or anyone begins a relationship with God, where you become a follower of Christ, that you're brought into his family, and that you're made to be a son, a daughter of God. And with that whole transaction, he first of all speaks of it negatively. He says, know that you were not redeemed. You didn't come into a relationship with God. And I want to deal with the second half of the statement first. He says, you are not redeemed from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. So he's saying, listen, understand that you did not begin, no one begins a relationship with God, again, through aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. Well, what exactly is that? Well, conduct is what? It's behavior. It's how you live. He says, through tradition, what does that mean? It means that there were no set established formal rules. This wasn't someone reading set instructions and then doing this. He's talking about that it became an established practice, an established pattern of behavior through watching other examples. And he says you've received this from your fathers. That's speaking, this has been going on generationally, going from your father to your grandfather, great-grandfather, all the way back. This is how it's been. To put it another way, very simply, he's saying this, understand that you did not become a child of God. You weren't brought into his family. You don't have a relationship with him because you started doing what everybody else was doing and what everybody else has always been doing. Now, you recognize that what Peter is penning here under the inspiration of the Spirit was written a couple thousand years ago. He's writing to people who were in the 1st century A.D., and you think, man, we're just kind of light years beyond them. I mean, the advances in science and medicine and technology and just the whole realm of knowledge is so much more expansive than it was in the 1st century. And all of those things are true. I mean, if Peter's audience could just see our world in the 21st century for an hour, it would just blow their minds. I mean, the things that we've come to know and discover, the technology that we have, the equipment, the discoveries that we have made, their minds would be blown. And though there are these differences, I want you to think about this. In truth, in terms of our cultures, we're not that different. And I say that because of this. Outside the limitations imposed by governmental or statutory law, people were doing then essentially what people are doing today. Which is what? Whatever they want. People in the 1st century were doing whatever they want. If it feels good, if it seems right, if everybody else is kind of doing this, well then that's kind of what we do. And when the majority of people act that way, that becomes the drift of, the direction of, the flow of culture. Consequently, behavioral and moral standards, well, they just get to be determined by what the majority of people are doing. If this is what the majority of people are doing, well, then that must be right. Or that because they're not doing this, then the opposite must be wrong. And the consensus of public opinion determines what is and is not acceptable. Unless your head is in the sand and has been that way for some time, do you not recognize that's going on today? And it was true in Peter's day, but it's true in our day, that collectively our societies, collectively our cultures are just kind of looking where everybody is deciding, well, hey, this is kind of what I want to do, and what is right or wrong is determined by the majority and what they are doing. But what does Peter say about all of this? He has a word for it. He calls it aimless. The Greek word there is matairos, and it literally means vain or useless. Doing, he says, what everybody else is doing and just kind of going along with the flow, and you doing whatever you think is right or whatever collectively society has decided this is okay and that's not okay. He's saying that's absolutely fruitless. It yields no benefit. It is vanity, and it accomplishes no good. Think about it for a moment. When it comes to sexual morality, collectively, this is what our society says. Do whatever you want, with whomever you want, whenever you want. That's what they're saying. And obviously, there is an extent to which doing that, well, that may feel good. Now, redefining marriage to be whatever collectively society thinks it should be, could be, or ought to be, that may sound good for now. Talking to people however you want, using whatever language and saying just whatever comes to your mind, there's absolutely a sense in which that's the easy thing to do, and man, it can sure feel good to do that for now. Spending money however you want, on whatever you want, whenever you want, that surely comes easy, and it seems and can feel good for now. However, at some point in the future, Peter says that God is going to do something that he reveals in verse 17. He is going to hold every single person to account. Every person in particular that's a follower of Christ, he is going to judge each one's work. And he says again that this is not going to be a superficial, just kind of looking at the outside, from a far distance, but to the very core of our being, inside and out, he is going to hold us to account. And when that day comes, when he is holding us to account for our behavior, what good will come from having done just what felt good? Well, none. And Peter is saying that's aimless. It's futile. It's a dead-end path. Centuries before, Solomon in his wisdom put it this way in Proverbs chapter 14. There's a way that seems right to man, but the ways thereof lead to death. Separation from God. When you or I or any stand before the Lord and he asks very simply, why did you do this? How well do you think it's going to go over to say, well, because I wanted to? How well do you think that's going to go over? When God says, why did you do that? How well do you think it's going to go over to say, well, everybody else was doing it? When God says, why did you do that? How well do you think it's going to go over to say, well, we just kind of thought it was okay? Let me just tell you, it's not going to go well. The majority of my life has been spent in the city of Charlotte, and among the things that are true of Charlotte is that it has some excessive zoning restrictions. Among the zoning restrictions included in their city statutes are these. As a commercial property, you cannot cut your trees however you want to. Excessive pruning is prohibited. So back in 2011, there was a church in Charlotte. The name of it is Albemarle Road Presbyterian. They're on a busy street, and there's a number of crepe myrtles that had been planted years before, and their crepe myrtles did what crepe myrtles do. Over time, they get kind of big. They get gangly, they get overgrown. And what had happened is that it had gotten to the point, and these trees had gotten to the point where they were effectively obstructing the view of the building from the road. And so members within the church decided, you know what we need to do is to cut these things back, and we'll give them a good healthy cutting, and in time they'll sprout new branches and they'll get bigger again. But at least we can get them back within bounds. And so that's what they did, and they pruned these things heavily. Now, what they were supposed to have done, though, as a commercial property, was to consult and call, first of all, the city's forestry division. The city would then send out an arborist who would tell them how much they could cut these trees back, how many branches they could cut off, how short they could take these trees. But they didn't do that. After all, these were their crepe myrtles. It was on their property. They thought this looked better. They thought this looked best. They felt that this was an improvement. The city didn't think it so. They prune these, and then they get notification from the city that they are being fined for this. $100 per branch that they cut off. They cut off 47 branches. They get a bill from the city for $4,700 for excessive pruning. And you say, oh, wait a minute, time out. That doesn't make any sense. After all, these are their trees on their property. But the problem is, their trees on their property is not in their city. Very easily, people will say, even professed followers of Christ can and sometimes do say, but it's my body and it's my life. I would respond to that with the words of an old hymn. But this is my Father's world. Now, people can say, well, it's my life and it's my body and I can do whatever I want, and collectively in society, that's what's going on. But Peter is saying, listen, that is a dead-end path, because everyone is going to stand before the Lord, because ultimately it is His world, and ultimately you do not belong to yourself, and He's going to hold you to account and to measure you against standards, not your standards or society's standards, but by His standards. And failure to take that into account, he said, man, that's a dead-end path. That's aimless. It's futile. It's useless. If you want to live your life in keeping with what Peter says in verse 17, if you want to be able to do this, where you conduct yourself throughout the time of your stay here in this reverent fear of God, know that living any other way other than keeping with His standards, it really is. It's a waste of time. It's futile. It's useless. He says, know that. Keep that thought in the front of your mind. But there's a second thought that he wants us to get in the forefront of our mind. It very simply is this: you cost a lot. You cost a lot. Let's go back and get the first part of what he says in verse 18. He says, know that you were not redeemed, again, brought into a relationship with God, with, he says, corruptible or perishable things like silver or gold. Well, what was silver or gold in the first century? When push comes to shove, this was the currency of the day. This was how you would buy and sell things in gold or silver. And so this is a way of Peter saying, you were brought into the family of God. You were made a child of God, a son or daughter of God, not because God wrote a big check and it was a big old stack of cash. It wasn't a monetary gift that brought about your redemption. Rather, he says in verse 19, how this happened was with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Now, we could spend a lot of time going back and talking about the Old Testament symbolism here relative to the sacrifices of the Old Testament. But this is what I want you to get. When Peter speaks of Jesus' blood as being without blemish and without spot, what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about how, in terms of sin, Jesus was pure. There was no wrong to be found in Him. There was no sin that had ever been committed. Jesus lived an absolutely perfect life. Now, why does Peter communicate this? Well, I believe he does so to establish a contrast. He's saying that the blood of Jesus is without spot, it's without blemish, without stain, a perfect life as compared to what? Well, to me, to you, to us. In short, what he's saying is that the Father expensed the precious, spotless, without blemish blood of Jesus to gain those that were covered with spots and blemishes. This whole ordeal, though, Peter describes as being redeemed, speaking of the process of redemption. And the redemption that Peter describes here very much works in the opposite from how we typically experience or conduct redemption. Let me see if I can paint the picture this way. About 6 weeks ago, I had taken our van in for some service. I needed to get the oil changed, but the van had like 83,000 miles on it. We'd never replaced the brakes, and I could tell that when I would push the brake pedal down, I felt like, before long, we're going to be like the Flintstones, and I'm going to have to get my feet out here to stop this thing. And so I told them when I dropped it off, I said, can you check the brakes? I said, my sense is they're probably about shot, need to be replaced. And so a short time later, he calls me back. He said, yeah, those pads, they're virtually down to nothing, about to a millimeter. He said, you really need new brake pads. And so I said, well, what's this going to cost? He said, well, what we recommend is getting everything taken off, machine the rotors, put on new pads front and back, machine the rotors front and back. I said, what's this going to cost? He said, it was going to be ballpark, parts, labor, taxes, all that stuff, about $400. So I said, well, go ahead and do it. Anyway, the hours pass. I go back later that afternoon to pick the van up. I pay them, I get my keys, I get in the van, and I'm heading home. And when I come out of the parking lot, I don't hear anything. But if I get the van over 30, 35 miles an hour and I apply the brakes, I'm hearing this noise. It kind of sounds like a fire truck slowing down, like, You shouldn't hear, unless you're a fire truck, right? Anyway, so I called them on my cell phone and I said, listen, I'm hearing this noise when I apply the brakes from higher speeds. And they said, well, that's not entirely unusual. Sometimes it happens when you machine the rotors and you put new pads on. It takes a little bit before the pad gets seated well on this machined rotor. He said, give it 250, 500 miles and it should take care of itself. If it doesn't, you can bring it back to us. So we were going to be going to the beach within a week or so. So it was about 10 days that passed, and we, in that period of time, drove the van about 600 miles, and the sound didn't get any better. If anything, it got worse. And it was so frustrating. And so a week ago this past Friday, I took it back down there. And I explained the problem to them. They said, okay, we'll take care of it. And a few hours later, I come back, and they have remachined the rotors, and they have reinstalled the brake pads. And so this is to take care of it. And I'm in the process of checking out. They're going to give me my keys back. And this is how the conversation went. And I wasn't dramatic or angry or anything. I was very calm and cool, droll, if you will. That's how I roll. Anyway. Thank you, Heather. Anyway, so I said to them, now, listen, I paid $400 to get this done. And to me, that price is to have it done right the first time. But I've had to endure this for a couple of weeks now, gone 600 miles. Now the rotors have been machined again. It's cost me more time and more aggravation. I paid that price to get it done right the first time. I said, is there any way then that you can help me with that price? And he said, well, I'm not charging you for today. Well, duh. I didn't say, well, duh, but I said, well, I understand you're not charging me for today, and you can't charge me for today because this wasn't done correctly. That's why I'm having the problems. Again, I paid full price to get it done right the first time. It wasn't. It's cost me more time, more aggravation, and my rotors are a little bit thinner now. How can you help me? And he said, I don't know what I can do. He said, can I give you a free oil change? I said, that's something. I said, I want you to understand, I'm not trying to get something for nothing. I said, but to me, there's a principle at stake here. And he said, yeah, I get you completely. And he steps away from the counter. He goes back to the office, and he's working on the computer for a second. He comes out with a printout. a piece of paper that has printed on there, not one, not two, but 3 free oil changes. He signs off on these. Now, with that piece of paper, I immediately decide I'm going to take care of that. I make sure that I know where I put it. I tell Caroline where I put it because I don't want to lose this. We say, well, why? After all, it's just a piece of copy paper that's been through the printer. Well, yeah, I understand that. It's just a piece of paper, but at some point I'm going to take in that piece of paper that of itself is worth nothing, and I'm going to exchange it. I'm going to redeem it for something of real value. Now, that's how redemption works for us, isn't it? We take a coupon, we take a certificate, we take a gift card, something that in and of itself has no value, and we redeem it for something of far greater value. Now, do you realize that what Peter's talking about here is exactly the opposite? He says that the Father did something, that He took the precious blood of Jesus, without blemish and without spot, of incalculable worth, of highest, greatest value, sinless, perfect life, given to get people covered with spots and blemishes, the furthest from perfect. That's a big deal. That's an enormous deal. That this greatest of prices was paid to get that which in the scheme of things seems to have no value. Peter is saying, though, you cost God a lot. Because of that, you could say of you, of me, of any, you're valuable. You're valuable. Now, value and the whole concept of value is interesting to me on a couple of fronts. First of all, value is interesting because ultimately, when push comes to shove, value is not determined by what you say something is worth. Value is determined by what somebody will pay for it. Right? Like, for example, let me grab a bulletin here. All right, here is a bulletin, Gate City. Let me sign my name to this. All right, so here is a bulletin with my signature on it. I could go and I could give this to Calvin. I'd say, Calvin, you take care of this bulletin. It is worth now, because of my signature on it, it's worth $10,000. You take care of that, worth $10,000. Now, you laugh at that because you know my signature is not worth $10,000. Nobody's going to pay $10,000. $9,500, but not $10,000, right? Value is ultimately determined by what someone will pay. Again, think about what Peter says. The precious, spotless, perfect, without blemish blood of Christ was paid for you. Value is determined by what one is willing to pay. But there's another thought relative to value. Value is determined by what someone will pay, and that which is deemed valuable affects how you care for it, how you treat it, and what you do with it. It is because of that fact, for example, on Friday, I went out to cut my grass. Perhaps shockingly, I didn't wear this. I had on a pair of old, entirely too big khaki shorts covered in paint and grease stains. I mean, I didn't have a belt on. I'm constantly doing like this. I look like a rapper out there, and I've got this old stained T-shirt as well, and that's what I'm cutting grass in. And you could say, and you would be correct, those pants, that shirt, worth nothing. Not only in terms of their condition, but because not much was paid for them, and they're old and they're worn out. Nobody would pay anything. And so that's why I use these, because they're not valuable. That's why I didn't wear this suit, because this suit cost me a lot more money. Its value, which is determined by the price that's paid, determines how you treat it, determines what you do with it. Taken together, Peter's trying to paint a picture for us. And He's not saying that you're valuable because of your intrinsic worth, or because you think yourself to be something wonderful. Rather, He is saying you're valuable because of a price that was paid for you. You cost a lot. You cost the precious, spotless blood of Jesus that was free from blemish, free from stain. So let's bring all this together and tie it up so that we've got something to do with this. If you have a relationship with Jesus, if you say, I'm a follower of His, well, that is true because of what God did. He redeemed you and paid an inordinate price for you. And as Paul says, you are no longer your own. You were bought with a price. Peter says it's a high price. Because of the price paid for you by the Father, you are viewed by Him as tremendously, tremendously valuable. And furthermore, you're going to stand before Him one day, and He will be judging you with what you did with you, with what you did with His valuable treasure. Now, when you know that, when you tell yourself what God has told us of ourselves as followers of His, I'm no longer my own, I was bought with a price, and I'm going to stand before Him one day to give an account, and He's going to want to know with what I did with me. Not what was mine, but that which was His. And that ought to make a difference. That ought to make a colossal difference. It ought to do what Peter describes, to lead you to conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in an absolute, genuine, reverent fear of God. He's given us the command. That's how we're to conduct ourselves. He's told us how to do that. To know that other paths, they're futile and aimless. To just do what everybody else is doing, to do whatever you want, that's a futile path. And then he says to tell yourself, remind yourself, you cost a lot. Well, if that's the expectation, and if this is the manner in which we're to do this, to accomplish this, I have one simple question for you. Are you doing it? Are you doing it? I want you to bow your heads with me. First of all, I'd say to you, if you're here this morning, and we've been talking about this whole idea of a relationship with God and being brought into His family and having a personal relationship with Him, you may hear that and say, well, I don't know if I've got that. I'm unsure. In just a moment, we're going to have a time of invitation. I want you to do something very simple. We're not going to shame you, not going to humiliate you, but will you step out from where you are? When we begin to sing, will you come and share that with me? Let me pray with you and begin a conversation with you so that you can know this, so that you can experience this, so that you can, as Peter describes, be redeemed. But if you're here and you say, well, Michael, I already did that. I did that a long time ago. I know these things. In fact, I know that other paths are futile. I know that I cost Him a lot. Very simply, does your life reflect that? I mean, really reflect it? Teenager, and how you're operating at school. I know the school year's about over. Does the decisions that you make relative to the parties that you attend, the things that you say, the habits that you have, even the friends that you have, does it reflect the fact